Buenas tardes, licenciado.
Buenas tardes, licenciado.
Buenas tardes,
Buenas
licenciado.
Bueno, hoy vamos a hacer una cosa súper divertida. Espero que no se cuelgue el internet. Vamos a ver una película y vamos a ir comentando, porque la película tiene ¿qué se llama? Como pedacitos. Bueno, no les he mandado antes, ¿no? Se llama Freaknomics. A ver, les voy a mandar un WhatsApp. Estoy revisando. CPA. Un comercial por si acaso. Un comercial por si acaso. Les he mandado un tríptico. ¿Han visto? No
Sí.
lo han visto. ¿Saben qué? Se trata de un estudio. Se trata de un estudio que está realizando la Facultad de Medicina sobre el nivel de anticuerpos que tenemos después de recibir vacunas por COVID-19. Entonces, aquellos que quieran saber su nivel de anticuerpos pueden ir a esa dirección. El requisito es que se hayan hecho vacunar hace 60 o 90 días máximo, su última dosis. Si tienen vacunas antes, no sirve. Tienen que ser de 30, 60 a 90 días, me parece, máximo la vacuna. Y lo que van a hacer es, les van a hacer una prueba de laboratorio y ellos van a pagar los laboratorios, todo, ¿no? A ustedes solamente les van a dar los resultados de las pruebas COVID. Bueno, los otros requisitos es que sean mayores de edad. Tal vez hay alguno de 17 no va a poder ir, pero los mayores de edad pueden ir. Y ¿qué van a medir? Les repito, les van a medir su nivel de anticuerpos para ver si la vacuna les está haciendo efecto en ustedes, ¿no? De eso se trata el estudio que están haciendo. No sé si tienen preguntas sobre eso.
Licenciado,
Bueno.
¿te pide algo? Un requerimiento, digamos, un carnet
Sí.
o algo, licenciado. ¿Puede ir cualquier persona que no sea de la universidad o tiene que ser de la
Creo que no.
universidad?
Solamente cualquier persona que no sea de la universidad puede ir. Cualquier persona puede ir. Lo importante es que sus vacunas la última vacuna sea hace 30, hace 60 días o 90 máximo. Ahí tienen los teléfonos, también pueden consultar. Es interesante, ¿no? Yo he participado la otra vez, este es un segundo estudio que están haciendo, y hasta ahora me siguen dando, me sacan un poco de sangre y me dicen mi nivel de anticuerpos, entonces sirve como para cuidarnos, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, yo sé que tengo un buen nivel de anticuerpos, por lo menos es lo último que me están reportando, y voy haciendo control así sobre mi nivel de anticuerpos. Así que, y ahí están los requisitos, por si acaso en el tríptico. Claro, no pueden participar algunas en personas que tienen algún cierto tipo de condiciones, ¿no? Dice leucemia, diabetes, esas personas sí no podrían participar. Y que no estén resfriados, digamos. Tienen que estar sanitos. Pero bueno, ahí está. Me han dicho que están haciendo un video. Cuando pasen el video también les voy a mandar. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, vamos a ver la película entonces. A ver, ¿de qué trata la película? En realidad es un documental que resume varias investigaciones y vamos a ir aplicando los conocimientos que tenemos hasta ahora y después vamos a utilizarlo también otra vez la película con los siguientes temas, pero vamos a ir aplicando. Entonces voy a ir parando yo estoy mirando con ustedes y voy a ir parando la película de rato en rato mientras vamos viendo. Voy a compartir ya. También les he mandado si quieren ver en su casa sin conexión, ahí está el link. Por si acaso tiene una particularidad de esta película, que como está en YouTube, el tiempo que se debe ver es a partir de cierto minuto, porque seguramente para evitar derechos de autor, cosas, se tiene que ver recién a partir del minuto 1:42. Y luego cuando termine todo, tiene que volver a empezarse de cero. A ver. ¿Están viendo? ¿Sí?
Sí, licenciado, se ve.
Bueno, miren, estoy empezando como que desde la mitad. O desde el 37:11, perdón, ¿no? Desde el 37:11. No es desde el 1:42, es del 37:11. A ver, empezamos. Voy a ir parando yo de rato en rato para ir comentando los que tienen que ver con la... Perdón, no les he pasado antes el video, ¿no veo? Sí. Sí. Hola. No, dice. Bueno, vamos entonces.
So I want to sell my home, and I put it on the market for $300,000.
It's a lovely home you have. I'm the agent.
All right, let me start over. That was might be good, but I'm starting over. All right, I want to sell my home. I put it on the market for $300,000. I get an offer today for $290,000. The question is, if I could wait a week and get an offer for the full $300,000, would I rather wait that week and get the full price, or take the offer today for $290,000?
You want to take it now. I'll be the real estate agent. I'm telling you, you want to take it right now because a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and the market is really starting to soften up. And these things, you just can never tell. And if you have a good offer, I really think it's the right thing to take it. And I'm not speaking out of self-interest here because I'm just a real estate agent, and our interests are aligned because I'm getting a commission of your sale. So I want you to get as much as you can for this house. I really do.
When you think about the incentives, that the current contract setup between the home seller and the agent representing them, they're not well aligned. But can you ever prove that?
Interestingly, if you look at the sales data on real estate agents' own homes, not their clients' homes, but when they sell their own homes, they get more money than if they sold the same home for a client. Now, why would that be? Well, what we find in the data is that agents hold out for a better price and leave their own homes on the market longer, an average of 10 days longer. But when it comes to your house, well, the agent has an incentive to sell right away.
Why? Because of that $10,000 into his or her pocket, only $150.
I only get
will go.
$150 because if you take that $10,000 extra dollars, it goes to him. 6% goes to commission, but that gets whacked up. Half goes to the buyer's real estate agent, so I've got half of that 6%, but then I have to kick back half of that to my agency. So I only get 1.5%. So really, in order for me to help him get $10,000 extra dollars, I personally only get $150. But I have to work for an extra week, I have to buy all the marketing, I could be off with another client trying to get a whole commission on another house. So I have a strong incentive to say to him, this is a great offer. It's the best offer you're ever gonna get. I really think you should take it.
So no matter what the real estate agent says, I would rather wait a week and pick up the extra $10,000. The agent wouldn't.
It's not that real estate agents are bad, it's just that they're human beings and human beings respond to incentives.
If there's only one element that I say is there in almost everything we do, it's the idea that incentives matter, and if you can figure out what people's incentives are, you have a good chance of guessing how they're going to behave.
New parents look at successful families and successful parents, and they just want to copy them, and so they try to do the things that they think that they did to get their family so smart and good and whatever, which is really just can be a really bad mistake of correlation causality. So like you're gonna...
Perdón. Quería ver ese tema de correlación y casualidad, pero no sé cómo volverlo atrás. A ver un cachito.
Parents, we want to believe so much that everything we do is going to make a difference in our children's lives. What they
A ver,
eat.
voy a volver a buscar.
I always said, you can teach a kid just as much at the grocery store as you can in a museum, maybe more. My entire academic life.
A ver, otra vez desde el inicio. Perdón.
Figuring out
Voy a pararlo justo cuando diga.
New parents look at successful families and successful parents, and they just want to copy them, and so they try to do the things that they think that they did to get their family so smart and good and
Ahí
whatever,
está.
which is really just
Lo cual realmente puede ser un mal error de correlación versus causalidad. ¿Se acuerdan? Hemos visto en la anterior clase esto. ¿Alguien se acuerda o no?
Las estadísticas, Lice.
En las estadísticas. Recuerden que hay 4 tipos de alcances, ¿no ve? Alcance exploratorio, descriptivo, correlacional y alcance explicativo. Y aquí está hablando él de los dos últimos. Dice correlación porque puede haber también una correlación entre dos variables, pero no necesariamente es una correlación verdadera. ¿Se acuerdan? Una correlación espuria, dice, ¿no? Entonces él está preguntando, puede ser un error de correlación, ¿no? ¿De qué está hablando? A ver, ¿cómo voy hacia atrás 5 segundos? Doble cliques, ¿no?
Con las flechitas.
Aquí, ¿dónde están las flechitas?
Como del teclado.
Ah, del teclado, del teclado. Ahí, a ver, vamos a poner este.
Families and successful parents, and they just want to copy. They think that they did get their families so smart and good and whatever, which is really just can be a really
Claro,
bad
dice, los padres tratan de hacer cosas para encontrar si sus hijos son inteligentes, ¿no? Entonces, dices, no sé, a ver, por ejemplo, yo soy papá de 3 chicos. Gracias por decirme lo de las flechas. Yo soy papá de 3 chicos. 2 niñas y un niño. Y cuando han nacido, todo me decían, ¿no ve? Por ejemplo, tiene que escuchar música clásica en el vientre de la madre, ¿no? Tiene que... hay que enseñarle los números y el alfabeto y las letras rápidamente. Los papás estamos dispuestos a hacer todo lo que nos digan. Ahora, ¿realmente eso funcionará? Es la pregunta, ¿no ven? Claro, es un problema de que funcione y encuentres, puede ser un problema como lo que hemos visto el otro día de los helados y la polio. Pero realmente eso es correlación, o el otro día de los divorcios y el consumo de mantequilla. Eso es correlación. Pero correlación no necesariamente quiere decir causa-efecto, es más, la correlación puede ser espuria o falsa, ¿no? A ver, lo que ellos van a preguntar es realmente qué funciona en el hecho de ser padres. Y vamos a ver algunos estudios adelante. La idea es ver la causalidad. La causalidad como causa-efecto, no casualidad, por si acaso, ¿no? Que es una letrita que varía. Causalidad como causa-efecto. A ver, sigamos viendo.
Causality. So like you're gonna take your kid to, you know, every mommy and me music class, and you're gonna take them to the museum and start looking at all the Greek and Roman sculptures, and you probably already were playing Mozart in the womb and things just to get the brain really stimulated. And it turns out that as best as we can tell from looking at data of actual parents and children along these dimensions, that none of
Esas
that
cosas
stuff really
realmente no
matters.
importan. Mirando los datos, dice, ¿no?
It just doesn't make your child better, smarter. It might make you happier, might even make them happier, might also make them miserable. But it turns out that those are not causal elements.
I always said you can teach a kid just as much at the grocery store as you can in a museum, maybe more. My entire academic life has been devoted to figuring out tricky ways to get at causality, because the world doesn't just offer you up causality. Okay, what you see in the world is correlation. What the world gives you is things are moving together or they aren't. But to be useful, you need to dive down, to be able to strip away what's causing what, what's not causing what. The data that we've looked at suggests that by the time you actually have a kid, most of the choices you make that will make you a good parent, you've already made them.
So if you go to the store and buy 10 parenting books, it's probably not going to really help the kid that much. But the fact that you're the kind of person who, as a parent, cares enough to go buy 10 parenting books, even if you don't read them, that probably means you're a pretty good parent. It's just don't think that the books are going to have a magic effect.
A ver, aquí me van a decir cuál es la pregunta de investigación. Atentos, por favor. Me van a escribir en el chat la pregunta de investigación. Es un trabajo, van a hacer una pregunta de investigación.
Parents, we want to believe so much that everything we do is going to make a difference in our children's lives. What they eat, where they go to school, who they hang out with. But before any of that takes place, parents are confronted with the one single ominous decision that could shape the entirety of their children's future. What is going to be their name? These days, there There's an entire industry devoted to naming your baby. And business is booming. There's magazines, books, websites. There's even high-profile baby naming experts.
I'm a baby name expert. I study names, I ask parents how they choose names for their children, and I look at how names are changing because baby names are changing today faster than ever before.
Names are important because they have a lot to do with your family, your heritage.
The name represents you, you know what I mean? Street credibility, all of that.
Names are definitely a big part of meeting someone.
A name can make you popular and a legend. Without a name, you're nobody. You gotta have a name. It tells your whole identity.
But just how important can names really be? I mean, unless it's Rockefeller or Gates, can your name have some sort of magical power over your entire destiny?
Ooh, the name fairy.
Not convinced? Well, what about the following story? Once upon a time, there was a young mother who thought she was naming her daughter after her favorite actress on The Cosby Show, the smart and fiery Tempest Bledsoe.
This is the most humiliating moment of my entire life, and there have been many.
But having never seen the way it was spelled, the young mother mistakenly named her newborn daughter. Didn't have an easy time growing up.
What? I don't even know if that's what you mean.
As a teenager, she became sexually promiscuous, got into a whole bunch of trouble.
Okay, you little shit! That's right, I better not pass you!
And ended up in court.
All rise!
Leaving the judge to ask her mother,
is young Temptress just living up to the expectations of her name?
was that one little misplaced T and R all that stood between a life of ease and Huxtable success versus those long, hard days in court and juvie? Harvard professor Dr. Roland Fryer was determined to find out just that.
What happened to Temptress has nothing to do with the name, has everything to do with where she grew up.
It turns out Temptress grew up in a poor black neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood Dr. Fryer's been studying for years. As a world-renowned economist and a leading expert on race in America, Fryer has long been interested in what he calls cultural segregation, the gap between white culture and black culture.
One embodiment of that culture is what you name your kid. It's probably one of the few cultural items that we can really measure precisely. What we did was we looked at the effects of your kid's first name on their life outcomes.
Dr. Fryer analyzed the naming records of every baby born in the state of California over the last 40 years, and those names tell an unmistakable story. African-American parents are more likely than any other ethnic group to give their children unique names.
There is definitely a distinction between names for white people and names for black people.
Black names be like Malik, Jaquan, Nashawn, Naheem,
Tasha and Shamika. Shaniquas and the Nashons and the Kayshons.
I know this girl, her name is Treasure, T-R-E-Z-U-R-E. Struck me as a typically, more African-American name.
I like the names that begin with S-H-A, like Shaheem, Shahid, Shamar,
Shaquem, Shakur. Oprah is popular.
It was actually in the 50s and the early 60s that we saw huge overlaps in the naming patterns of blacks and whites. So people, naming their kids John, Michael, names like that. And what you saw was around in the 1968 or so, kind of the Black Power movement actually, you saw distinct bifurcation with black names getting more distinctively black, and a lot of them were Islamic names. Because the Black Power movement was about identity. Who are we? Who are you? Are you part of us? It wasn't until the late 80s and 90s that we started to get, kind of the made-up, concatenated names that you see now.
This generation today, they sort of changed the whole name concept. They have names that are 30 letters long, and...
Now, everybody try to do something, unique. They try to name their kid over something different,
We had 228 unique versions of the name Unique. Again, my favorite was U-N-E-Q-Q-E-E. Another one of my favorites was U-N-E-E-K. So there are a lot of people are trying to be unique.
So what happens to all these uniquely named kids? Kids like poor little Temptress.
I think it's not the name that's doing the damage to Temptress. It's that they grow up in the type of situation where someone would name their kid Temptress. The person who actually would name their kid that probably has a host of other issues.
Ah, está cortada la película. ¡Qué barbaridad! Debe continuar los nombres en otro pedazo. Por aquí continúa. Lo voy a volver a donde continúa allá. Claro, es que es pirata porque está en YouTube, por eso pasa esas cosas. Lo voy a continuar por ustedes. Qué macana, salta, ¿no? Pensé que continuaba. Debe haber en algún lado completa y bien hecha, pero voy a continuarlo donde está. A ver, vamos a ver. Mientras tanto, ¿cuál era la pregunta de investigación? Es pues súper interesante la película. Pero ¿saben qué? Se corta, pasa de un caso a otro, está desordenada. El que lo ha subido desordenado seguramente para evitar el filtro de YouTube para que la identifiquen como derechos de autor. Si alguien me encuentra en alguna otra plataforma, me avisa, por favor. Pero mientras tanto, ¿cuál es la pregunta de investigación?
Bien, licenciado, yo puedo decir, o yo he identificado que la pregunta es ¿cómo influyen los nombres asignados al nacer en la personalidad de esa persona o de ese individuo?
Ya, va por ahí, muy bien. ¿Qué dice la respuesta? ¿Cuál es su hipótesis? ¿Influye o no influye?
Licenciado, influye mucho porque hoy en día, cuando nosotros, digamos, nuestros padres ya nacemos, entonces van buscando, por ejemplo, Shakira, nombres populares como futbolistas y todo ello. ¿Para qué? Con el objetivo de que seamos reconocidos, populares y así. Pero sin embargo, como yo he visto en el video, ha tenido un nombre popular, pero la persona no ha sido grata. O sea, ha tenido un mal aspecto. No ha sido como sus papás han querido que sea como esa persona.
Ya, bueno, pero influye nuestra personalidad. Interesante, ¿no? La pregunta. Gracias por sus respuestas. Tengo hartas respuestas. Parece que le está gustando la película. Efectivamente, va por ahí, ¿no? Pero más allá de eso, es, como él dice, no es el nombre, ni como el primer asunto que decían, a ver, hacen escuchar a Mozart, le compran 10 libros a su hijo, etc. No ese es el tema. Uno puede decir al final, ¿sabes qué? Ya mi hijo salió, no sé cómo dice, profesional porque le compré Mozart. No fue ese tema. Sino fue porque los papás estuvieron dispuestos a sacrificar y darle el tiempo. Pero también encontrarán que hay muchos otros factores. Yo algún rato les he contado, yo tengo un papá que es enfermo mental, entonces, mi papá, además de darme algunas palizas que me ha dado de niño, ¿no? Algún rato me ha roto la nariz, mi papá me ha... claro, ¿qué le puedo decir? Yo lo quiero mucho a mi papá, además, de enfermo mental no sé, pues... hay otras cosas que influyen, ¿no ve? Y el investigador dice, ojo, más que el nombre, más que darle esas cosas, eso que puede parecer es una correlación espuria. Lo que está influyendo son los factores del medio ambiente que están influyendo. Entonces, no es porque ella se llama tentación, ¿no? Temptress. No es porque es temptress. Es porque creció en un barrio difícil, ¿sí? Con una madre probablemente con poca educación, en un vecindario donde había delincuencia. Son esos los factores los que han influido, no por el nombre. A ver, continuaremos viendo. Interesantes sus respuestas. Vamos a ver.
Let's look at a boy with the study's most common white name, and a boy with the study's most common African-American name.
The person who gives their kid a distinctively black name, on average, is more likely to live in poverty, and to be kind of on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder.
You see, this is where Jake lives, and this is where Deshaun lives.
In Deshaun's neighborhood, you know, the schools are not functioning. The teachers in those schools aren't the same quality as would be in Jake's neighborhood. In those neighborhoods, 80% of the households are female-headed only. And what we found is that names don't matter so much. The type of mother you have, the type of family you have, the type of community you grow up in, those things matter a lot. But what they name you just doesn't matter.
So a name doesn't define your destiny?
Maybe if you name someone Destiny, I don't know, but no, I mean your name doesn't define your destiny.
A name may not define your destiny, but it can dictate the way other people perceive you. Meet Harvard professor Dr. Sindel Malainathan.
I'm very familiar with Roland Fryer's work. We've both worked on the impact of names. I think Roland has emphasized that the people who choose names that are very black are different from the people who choose names that are not very black. Whereas we've emphasized that holding everything else constant, the people who end up with very black names are treated very differently. We know that in the data, African Americans earn a lot less. And we're interested in how much of that earning less is simply because they find it harder to get a job. And are African Americans treated very differently in the labor market than whites?
Dr. Malainathan conducted his own study, this time in Boston and Chicago.
What we did is we made up 5,000 resumes. Half of
Aquí, por favor, su atención, porque van a describir un diseño experimental. ¿Sí? Wendy, tienes razón, lo que define son otros factores, pero aquí van a definir un diseño experimental. Lo vamos a ver más adelante, así que tienen que recordarlo. Se puede investigar de dos maneras, observando o haciendo experimentos. Como en colegio, experimentos, no sé, bicarbonato de sodio con limón y lo colocas en una botella a ver si explota. Entonces, claro, hay una fuerte presión y explota la botella. Ya está. Es un experimento, ¿no? Pero aquí también es un experimento social. No esos experimentos truchos que aparecen en el Facebook, en el TikTok. Un experimento en serio, ¿no? Controlado, con estadística, con muestras, etc. Nos va a comentar este doctor Mullahatans su estudio.
In Boston and Chicago.
What we did is we made up 5,000 resumes. Half of them we put an African-American name, half of them we put a white name. Otherwise, the resumes were the same. And we sent them out. And then we said, which got called back more? And what we found was that the same resume, when it had an African-American name, was about 33% less likely to get an interview than when it had a white name. It means that if a white person is searching for a job for 10 weeks, an equivalently skilled African-American person would be searching for 15 weeks. And those are 5 long weeks if you're unemployed.
You can judge somebody by their name. It's not right, but people do it. They assume that just because your name is Monique or your name is Lavon or Shaniqua, that you're African American and you're not qualified because your name has an ethnicity to it.
One time there was a girl named Lakeisha. I talked on the phone, and I thought she was black, but when I met her, I was totally shocked that she was a white Southern girl.
When I picture Rashonda, yeah, she's black.
The names we used in our study were names like Lakeisha, Jamal, Tyrone. Based on our results, it raises a question. I'm an African-American parent. I'm thinking of naming my child. Tyrone sounds like a very good name. I might have had a grandfather named Tyrone. Should I name my child Tyrone? Yes, naming your kid Tyrone, you have made it harder for them in the labor market. On the other hand, should you give in to that? Should I give in to the prevailing norms, or should I express my individuality as I want? It's a bit of an ethical quandary.
My friend's got a drug dealer named Tyrone that I assume is a black guy.
Todd is a white name. Tyrone is a black name. I mean, that's sort of how it goes, right?
You might choose a distinctly black name as a way to signal something about yourself and about your commitment to the black community. And that's a way to show other African Americans, look, I am really black. And I think the fact that there are distinctly black names already tells you that there is a cultural divide at some core, visible, noticeable level. And we see it sometimes in clothing, we see it in names. And in fact, it's true, there are quite a few distinctively white names like Emily, Brendan, I'm forgetting what those, if you give me a minute, I can come up with the others.
White names is like Sarah, Megan,
Maria, Mary,
Billy,
Becky's, John's,
Tad, Joe, Mike,
Ryan, Sam,
Chester.
My brother and I were talking about how we had pretty white-sounding names. He's Abner, I'm Harper, Stone Phillips. Look, that's like perfectly suited for a white guy. This is the best white guy name you could have.
We live in different cultures, and your name is largely determined by your culture. And the difference in the incidence of Lakeisha amongst African Americans versus whites might be a good way to understand how truly there are different cultures that African Americans inhabit and whites inhabit.
Today, there's more evidence than ever that the culture we come from influences the names we choose. Just ask the baby naming expert.
More and more today, you see almost as if they're launching a product, that you're trying to position your child for the best chance of success in a global marketplace.
So in an oversaturated marketplace, which names garner the most attention? Are some names destined for the top shelf while others are headed for the bargain basement? Let's take a look at two different product lines. Turns out there is such a thing as a knockoff name. The top 5 middle-class white girl names from Fryer's study are, in order of popularity, Ashley, Lauren, Jessica, Emily, and Sarah. While the top 5 lower-income white girl names are Brittany, Samantha, Amanda, Jessica, and Ashley. So what's happened to Ashley? She's fast losing her popularity on the middle-class list, but she's #1 among the Walmart crowd. As those wealthier folks see their names popping up everywhere, they quickly discard them in favor of less common merchandise. And just like that, today's high-end Ashley becomes tomorrow's low-rent Trashly. On the lowest rung of the ladder are the names that most signify lower-class parents, like Misty, Destiny, Bobby, Brandy, or Cindy. Now, if you're over 40 and actually remember a time when these names didn't belong up here on stage, you're right. Years ago, these names wouldn't be caught dead in a place like this. But the years have not been kind to a name like Bobby, and even though she once was at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, today, she's just clinging to her former glory.
Please don't name your kid Barbie or Bambi or anything like that. They might end up being a dancer one day because of it.
And if you do end up with a name that's bound for stripperdom, at least you can change it. I mean, hey, it works in Hollywood. Think about it. Would John Wayne have been as tough if his name was Marion Morrison? Would we think Marilyn Monroe was as beautiful if her name was still Norma Jean? And would we think of Ice Cube rocking the crowd if his name was still O'Shea Jackson?
Actually, I always wanted to change my name to Max Powers, because it seems like a name that everybody, like, once they hear that, they're like, dang, this guy must be really cool.
I wanted to change my name when I was younger. I never liked it.
If my name was Henry Obama, you know what I mean? I think that would mean something to people, and I would have more doors open for me.
I did want to change it, but now I'm sort of cool with it. It just sort of like jumps on your back and rides along with you through life, you know?
As much as you may hate your name, at least your dad isn't this guy. Meet Robert Lane. He had 2 sons. He named his first son Winner. 3 years later, he named his next son Loser. So Winner and Loser Lane set off in the world to claim their destinies. And what happened? Well, Loser went to prep school on a scholarship, graduated from college, joined the NYPD, and eventually became a detective and then a sergeant. He goes by Lou now. And his brother? Well, the most noteworthy achievement of Winter Lane is the sheer length of his criminal record. Nearly 3 dozen arrests for burglary, domestic violence, trespassing, and other mayhem. Is there one name that you can give a kid that will guarantee they won't become a screw-up?
No. Sorry, there is not one name that you can give a kid to guarantee they won't become a screw-up, and there is not one name that you could give a kid to guarantee that they'll actually be a success. You know, it is a crapshoot when it comes to names.
I don't think there's any name that can guarantee success, at least none that we found. You know, the world is full of excellent people and terrible people with all sorts of names, but the vast majority of the reasons people choose is left unexplained. It's like, why did you choose your child's name? Sounded nice.
Who really knows what parents are thinking when they choose a name? Maybe your parents went with something traditional, or something bohemian, something unique, or something perfectly trendy. And maybe your parents didn't have the best taste and you can't stand your name, or maybe they got it just right.
Actually, my name means intelligent hero, so that describes me to the fullest.
I was actually named after a horse. My dad's a horse trainer.
My middle name is Comfort because an angel of the Lord came down to my mother and told her she was going to have a daughter with dark hair and blue eyes, who would be a great comfort to her.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was the last seal of all the prophets.
My name says that I'm named after my grandfather, who was named after his great-grandfather. That's what it says.
In the end, most parents just want the best for their children. And if they believe a particular name can give their kid that extra edge, then why not? I mean, who knows? It just might work.
A ver, comentarios. Antes de los comentarios voy a explicar el experimento. Un experimento trata de hacer una comparación en dos grupos. Se supone que los grupos son aleatorios, pero eso no voy a entrar a detalle con eso. Entonces, es un experimento en el que tienes los nombres blancos y los nombres de los afroamericanos, ¿no? De personas de color. Esa es la diferencia entre ambos grupos. Y después, claro, se mide qué es lo que sucede en un tiempo después. Voy a volver a dibujar esto de otra manera. Se tiene currículums, ¿no? Hojas de vida exactamente iguales, solo que uno pertenece a los blancos y otro a los afroamericanos. Y se mide después cuánto tiempo después les reciben una llamada para llamarlos para ingresar a trabajar. Ese es un experimento. Se compara un grupo que se llama grupo experimental versus grupo control. Se supone que el punto de partida es igual, pero hay una diferencia. Un experimento, digamos, sería, yo tengo 2 tazas de café iguales, a una taza de café la mezclo con Coca-Cola y la otra no. Y a ver qué sucede con, no sé, mi atención, por ejemplo. Si el hecho de haberle puesto Coca-Cola está incrementando mi atención durante unos minutos, mi concentración. Ese es un experimento. Por si acaso, solamente para notarlo y después lo vamos a volver a ver. Bueno, no sé, comentarios, preguntas sobre... Estamos viendo lo que han visto de los nombres. Pueden escribir también si quieren.
Licenciado, ¿podría participar?
Claro.
Bueno, tengo 3 puntos que me han parecido muy interesantes. Y bueno, el primer punto que yo con ejemplos voy a tratar de desarrollar cada punto. Por ejemplo, ¿en qué no nos define un nombre? ¿O por qué un nombre no nos define? En mi caso, por ejemplo, yo tengo a mi papá que se llama Roberto, yo me llamo Roberto, mi abuelo se llama Roberto, mi bisabuelo también se llama Roberto. Ese es un nombre que se ha heredado así generación tras generación hasta que he llegado yo, hasta la actualidad. Y cada persona ha sido diferente. O sea, por ejemplo, yo he nacido en una sociedad con bajos recursos, en una familia precaria y demás, pero mi papá ha nacido en un buen lugar, ha nacido porque su papá era sindicalista, y mi abuelo, o sea, el papá de mi papá, ha nacido en una mejor situación que yo porque su papá era terrateniente. Entonces, en ese aspecto, el nombre varía según la situación del ambiente de la persona, por decirlo así. Entonces, voy a otro punto en que sí yo creo que sí afecta un nombre en el futuro, en nuestra sociedad. Por ejemplo, en nuestra sociedad varios hemos debido tener un amigo Brian, una amiga Kimberly, y cuando dicen esos nombres es como que guarden sus celulares, ¿no? Así de broma. Pero ese es un estilo de broma. Pero ya cuando les ponen nombres raros a los chicos, ahí ya en algunos casos surge un estilo de bullying a esas personas que tienen nombres extraños o nombres que, ¿cómo se podría decir? Que les generan un apodo, que les llaman de una forma, pero los padres en ese sentido yo identifico que cometen o no piensan muy bien, por decirlo así, o a veces tienen expectativas respecto al hecho o al momento de ponerle el nombre a su hijo. Por ejemplo, no sé, tienen la expectativa de que su hijo va a ser un jugador pero profesional de fútbol, entonces le ponen Cristiano Ronaldo y su apellido Espinosa Quispe, digamos. Entonces, con esa expectativa, pero de la expectativa a la realidad hay mucha diferencia. Entonces, tal vez ese Cristiano Ronaldo Espinosa aquí ha terminado siendo un contador grandísimo, pero no ha cumplido esa expectativa basada en el nombre de su padre, digamos. Y bueno, esos serían los 3 aportes que quería desarrollar o me han generado cuestionantes, licenciado.
Gracias, sí. Pero tú has dicho algunas cosas interesantes, ¿no? En realidad no es el nombre, como ellos dicen, porque le preguntan, ¿hay un nombre que te va a asegurar el éxito? Y dicen, no, es el contexto, el entorno, las cosas. ¿Quieres que tu hijo sea un experto jugador de fútbol? Pues llévale a jugar a la cancha todos los días desde que pueda caminar y vas a ver que lo vas a hacer un experto jugador de fútbol. Ustedes quieren ser unos expertos jugadores de fútbol y de básquet, quieren jugar ajedrez, quieren ser buenos en matemáticas, pónganse a practicar todos los días. Entonces, no es el nombre, ¿no? Entonces, eso lo dice. Un segundito, por favor, espérenme. Una cosita, justo tengo un inconveniente, un segundo, ahorita vamos a volver. Si quieren, mientras tanto, se los vuelvo a los comentarios o quieren esperarme un ratito. Un nombre no determina, sería con los signos zodiacales, correcto. Lo único que puede influir el nombre no es en cómo tal vez las personas puedan percibir de nosotros, pero como dijeron en el video, no hay nombre que defina a uno. Claro, la sociedad estereotipa varios tipos de nombres, pero no afecta el rendimiento académico de una persona. Sí. Lo que sí hay detrás, por ejemplo, de los nombres afroamericanos, que lo dijeron, no es por el nombre en sí mismo, porque había el experimento en el que los contrataban tarde, en realidad era por una situación de discriminación, ¿no? Étnica. La discriminación era a un grupo de personas afroamericanas. No era por el nombre, era porque la discriminación era hacia lo afroamericano. Seguramente si lo hubiera, no sé, pues podía haberse llamado Mike y llegaba al trabajo y era una persona afroamericana, entonces lo iban a discriminar por afroamericano y no por su nombre, ¿no? Entonces, y eso es otra vez el problema de correlación o causalidad. Racismo, como alguien dijo, Carla, sí. Sí, hay muchas cosas que analizar, ¿no? Miren cómo el tema de los nombres y lo que hemos visto durante el COVID. Tome caricari, tome tal cosa, tome otra cosa. Podías curarte, pero ¿realmente se habrá debido al caricari? ¿O al dióxido de cloro? Hay que estudiarlo, ¿no ve? Bueno, volvemos a empezar otra vez con esto. Dice cheating. A ver, voy a dejarles un ratito. Yo de verdad que los voy a dejar 3 minutitos porque tengo una cosa que solucionar, pero otra vez me conecto ahorita. Si ustedes sigan viendo, por favor.
A thing worth having is a thing worth cheating for. Or as Mark Grace of the Chicago Cubs once said, if you ain't cheating, then you ain't trying.
Everybody understands why a kid would want to cheat on the SATs, right? They have huge gains of being able to get into Stanford or Harvard and have a good life as a result of cheating on a test, okay? What's harder to think is why would a teacher cheat for a kid on a test? And yet when you go to Chicago and you look back a few years ago, we find that lots and lots of teachers were cheating. Well, why were they cheating? Well, because there's tremendous pressure on these teachers to produce high test scores so that their schools wouldn't get into trouble. First of all, it's very expedient to go to the end of the test. Because at the end of the test, a lot of kids have left things blank. So instead of having to erase something and fill it back in, you can just fill in the answers. Now, it might look kind of funny, because how often when kids take a test, do they answer the first 20 questions, leave 17 questions blank, and then fill in the last 8 questions, okay? And even maybe a little funnier when they fill in the last 8 questions and they get all the questions right. And those just happen to be the hardest questions on the exam. When I got the data from the Chicago Public Schools, I mean, we were talking about millions and millions of answers by thousands of kids over years and years. And I looked at the data, and I couldn't see anything. I mean, how could you see anything?
If you can think like a teacher who cheats, and then look again at the sea of data, these patterns come to light.
Patterns, which are subtle, that are buried in mounds and mounds of data, when looked at just through the right lens, suddenly it's just as clear as day. And once you know what to look for, you can't help but say this has to be cheating.
What he's really good at is like pretending he's a cheater and a criminal and a thief and a cheat and all these things, because really he's not that far from. I mean, if you think about what an economist is, the line between like economist and criminal is incredibly thin.
And what about journalists?
No line. Because he can put himself in the shoes of someone who would behave criminally or who's a cheater, then you can kind of back up the process and reverse engineer it. And that's what you have to do, because unless you're in the room with cheaters, it's really hard to catch them.
it's not that some people cheat in every setting or some people never cheat. We all cheat sometimes and not others. Everyone's got their own moral compass that determines what they'll do and what they won't do.
The Sumo Association dismissed the allegations as lies, told by a vengeful stablemaster, seeking to cash in on publicity. To defend their claims, the whistleblowers decided to hold a press conference. But 2 weeks before the press conference, both men died. In the same hospital, on the same day, from the same mysterious respiratory ailment.
大変不思議な出来事だと。つまり納得できない出来事だったと当時は思いました。
当時はその相撲賭博がすごく華やかで、力士の勝った負けたっていうのはオッズをものすごく左右するわけですよね。だからそこで彼が全てを暴露するっていうことは、その日本の闇社会のある種のタブーを犯すことになるんで、そこで彼は死なざるを得なくなってしまったのかなと僕は解釈してますけどね。
Yet no one questioned the way they died. There were no autopsies. The police did not investigate the sudden and simultaneous deaths.
Ya estoy aquí por si acaso. Cualquier pregunta me hace.
Told reporters, so there were no grounds for suspicion.
だからでその遺族がその解剖を望まなかったってなるんですけど、その前に司法解剖だろうっていう気はするんですけど、相撲に対する見方そのものが、それは警察だけじゃなくて社会的にそうなんですけど、なんかちょっとこうアンタッチャブルっていうか、治外法権っていうかね。
Concerns about the sport resurfaced when another mysterious death haunted sumo. This time, it was a young Rikishi in training named Takeshi Saito, whose corpse showed visible signs of assault and mutilation.
事件が発覚した後、親方は彼は稽古の上でのね、不慮の死であったと記者に対してそう答えているわけです。ところが事実はそうじゃなかった。そこで僕これはもう書くしかないなと思って書いたんですね。あれだけの傷を負いながら司法解剖されない、あれが自己死とされてしまう理不尽さ、それが日本に一体どのぐらいあるのかと考えると、やっぱりちょっとゾッとする話ですよね。一相撲界の話じゃない。そういった意味であの事件が投じた波紋というのはものすごく大きかったし、彼の遺体の語るものは多かったですよね。
Hiromasa Saikawa took note of the death of the young wrestler. Saikawa is one of the nation's most vocal critics of how murders are investigated in Japan. He quit his post on the Tokyo police force when the gap between the hone, the hidden truth, and the tatemae, the facade of propriety, had grown too wide.
日本の警察の殺人事件の検挙率は 96% をずっと超えております。これは到底信じられない数字でして、その数字は現実とは違うということを全ての警察官は知っています。
The job of any police force is to help keep crime at low enough levels so that society can properly function. The tatemae of the police force is to be seen as doing that. If the police, for example, can tell society, we solve 96% of crimes, they have certainly fulfilled their tatemae function in comforting society, making society feel safe. But to achieve that level of tatemae, the police might select only cases for investigation that they think they have an extremely high chance of solving.
他殺体が発見された場合ですね、その人物を殺した人間が誰なのかということが分かっている場合には、殺人事件として捜査を始めます。ところが誰が殺したのかは分からない。犯人がいつまでも捕まらなかった場合ですね、それは死体遺棄事件のまま終わってしまうということがあり得るんです。警察もスポーツの選手も努力の成果というものが数字で評価されます。検挙した数字だけでその警察が評価されると いい数字さえ上げられれば実際はどうであるのかを問わないという傾向がありますね。さまざまな工作をして数字を上げようとしますね。それで私は警察を辞めたいと思います。
Despite clear evidence of brutality, the police declared that the young man died of natural causes, and the stable master quickly asked for the boy's body so it could be cremated. But the angry father of the young man insisted on an autopsy, which revealed that he had been burned with cigarettes and beaten to death with beer bottles and baseball bats. The young boy had died at the hands of fellow wrestlers who were ordered by their stable master to punish the boy for trying to run away from the world of sumo.
相撲界にとっては非常にショッキングだし、もうこれまでのやり方は通用しないのだよということを明らかに示しているし、それから僕が書いた八百長の記事をきっかけに相撲界に対するその見方が世間非常に厳しくなっているので。
Sumo countered criticism with lawsuits against Takeda and his magazine. Juries ruled against Takeda in cases where he accused individuals of match rigging. But Sumo had no defense against the revelations of violence. To defend its reputation, the Sumo Association shores up its image by building on notions of purity from Shinto that are essential to what it means to be Japanese. Publicly, they insist that Yaocho is a myth.
I hope there was none of that going on in the bottom ranks, but where I was, no.
そういうしかないでしょ。俺もそういうふうに言いたいけどね。八百長なんかないとか。俺は正直に言うしかないからね。
A retired Rikishi who rose to Komusubi, the fourth highest rank in sumo, Keisuke Itai came forward and publicly admitted to fixing many matches, and named names of others who did the same.
彼は非常に強い力士でしたね。張りで一発で相手をノックアウトさせちゃうような。彼の師匠の親方が彼が相撲界に入ってすぐに八百長を仕組んだんですね。で彼は知らず知らずにその世界にはまり込んでしまった。だから麻薬と一緒で八百長っていうのは一回始めちゃうとなかなか抜け出せないですね。八百長を経済システムと仮定して言いますけど、大きなお金はそのピラミッドのトップの横綱に集まるんですね。何千万円というお金が仮に集まったとして、でそれを下にあまねっこ潤していく、相撲界全体に潤していくんです。そのためのツールとして八百長がある。
結局力士全体が真面目に取ればすごいなんていうか神がかりのスポーツだと思いますけどね。今でもやっぱり真剣勝負見ればやっぱり感動しますしね、八百長見ればやっぱがっかりするし、そんな感じかな。僕らはもう全部わかりますから、相撲見てて真面目に取ってるか取ってないかぐらいは。
しかし欧米では建前とは違うことをやった場合であってもですね、時間の経過とともにそれが明らかにされることがある。例えば公文書なんかも30年経てば原則公開するとか、日本の場合それが全くありません。永遠に闇に葬ることができるという強い信念を持っているようですね。
In Japanese media, there's a certain form of self-censorship. Giving interviews in Japanese, the media will not quote me if I use the word daraku, which is corruption in Japanese, and they'll change that instead to something like konran, confusion. We certainly have the very same thing in America today. The New York Times, for example, will not use the word torture to describe anything that's been carried out by Americans in operating our prison system in the war on terror. However, if it's the Chinese who've done these things to an American airman The New York Times has no compunction about calling those things torture.
The only way to combat corruption, says Stephen Levitt, is to change rules to undo corrupt incentives, unleash more investigative reporters, and develop strong protections for whistleblowers. But that's easier said than done when cultural slogans in America and Japan reassure us that we're honest, straightforward, and fundamentally good. Those who expose corruption are challenging the very nature of who we imagine ourselves to be.
The irony of our analysis of sumo wrestling was when it became public, the sumo wrestlers stopped cheating. And not for good. They actually stopped cheating for a year or two, and then once people stopped thinking about it, they went back to it. But that, I think, is the answer to how you stop cheating. That Louis Brandeis said that sunlight was the best disinfectant.
What keeps us from seeing corruption are our illusions that our economy is a rational system, a free market open to all. The fact is that rigging markets and matches is good business if the rigging is hidden from all but a few. In Shinto, the mirror is an important symbol, reflecting a sense of who we are. In that mirror, the bad heart is a hidden heart. The pure heart is one that hides nothing. Looking at the numbers and accepting what they tell us is a way of wiping dust away from the mirror.
Hay un pedacito ahí que se ha cortado, que ustedes están viendo el sumo, no sé en qué parte exactamente estaba, pero los voy a poner. O claro, puede ser cuando yo... Tal vez soy yo simplemente, como me he salido, no he visto, ¿no? Ese pedacito en el que uno de los jugadores se ve que se deja ganar. Eso lo han visto, ¿no? ¿O no lo han visto? Se deja ganar cuando tiene una pelea importante. No, por aquí está, por aquí está, por aquí está. ¿Qué acá en eso que esté cortado? A ver, bueno, van a buscar por favor la película, si alguien la encuentra. Ustedes que son unos capos del internet. Vamos a volver a las peleas esa mañana para terminar de entender ese. Eso. Ahí es.
Economics tries to be a pure science in an impure world. Economists imagine men and women as rational actors in a marketplace that hides nothing from buyers and sellers. But what happens to markets when people cheat?
10 years I've been interested in cheating, and I was in Washington, D.C. I remember seeing just a little blurb in the Washington Post that said there'd been allegations of cheating in sumo wrestling. And my view has always been, if some insider comes forward and says there's cheating, probably there's something to it. If you had said, where is a sport where you would not find cheating? I would have said, well, sumo wrestling would be a reasonable one. It's got 2,000 years of history. It's all about purification rituals and honor. It's located in a culture which on all of the rankings of corruption across countries is very, very low.
The ancient sport of sumo wrestling is the essence of pure competition. Two naked men fighting in a sandpit under the watchful eyes of a referee dressed as a Shinto priest. Shinto means way of the gods, a religion that celebrates the purity and harmony of man and nature.
In sumo, you do your ceremonial stuff. One is the clapping of the hands. That's to awake the gods. Two is when we show our hands and flip our hands over and stuff, is to show that we have no concealed weapons.
You're coming out, you're gonna fight fair with your bare hands, and to tell the guys that you're coming in with a fresh and clean mind and heart to wrestle.
The stomping of the feet in the Shinto religion is to stamp out evil spirits, and throwing of the salt is to purify.
神道と相撲というのは切っても切り離せない関係だと思います。神様を喜ばせようとする、そういう儀式を行いますね。
I think purity is a good mask for corruption, perhaps most so in that it discourages inquiry. It's true that sumo might seem to be immune from corruption because of its purity and its history and so on. On the other hand, the stakes are high. And when stakes are high, and when there's an incentive to cheat, a small percentage of people always will.
Just as in medieval Japan, the wrestlers, known as rikishi or strongmen, spend years in apprenticeship, living together around the clock and training in stables or beya, subject to strict moral and physical discipline.
If you're a sumo wrestler in the top ranks, your life is very, very good, and you can live like a king. Once you fall below those ranks or never attain those ranks, your life is not very good at all. So it's a very steep pyramid. At the top, life is great, and then there's a lot of people down below for whom life is not so great, but there are so many of them because they all aspire to get to the top, obviously.
It's a battle 24/7 being a sumo wrestler. It's not just two big fat guys trying to kill each other, but it's a lot of work to be big and at the same time active. 6 major tournaments a year. You have to wrestle with injuries. They throw you in the jungle and see how you can come out alive. The object of the game is to push your opponent outside of the ring or push him into the ring.
But how can you tell if a sumo wrestler is cheating? Is a slip on purpose? Is a fall rigged? It's hard to tell unless you look at patterns over time.
La palabra clave aquí son patrones. Cuando observamos la realidad, lo que buscamos son patrones, cosas que se repiten. Es un análisis profundo, ¿no? Y aquí lo que ayuda mucho, especialmente ahora, es la estadística, el Big Data. Recuerden que ustedes van a ser auditores. Y como auditores van a tener que encontrar patrones. ¿Sí? Hay que observar muy bien, ¿no? Y actualmente yo recomendaría mirar muy bien los datos. Esta película viene de un libro. Y en el libro pone el ejemplo del sumo, pero también pone otro ejemplo muy interesante de los exámenes escolares, donde se analizan millones de datos. Y actualmente lo que nos da potencia para analizar los datos es la computación los programas de computación y, por supuesto, la estadística. A ver, les dejo de seguir mirando. Pongan atención por el patrón que va a mencionar.
It's hard to tell unless you look at patterns over time.
People who are being corrupt are always trying to actively cover their trail. So corruption is, by its nature, hard to identify, hard to prove. Murder is really great, because almost always when someone's murdered, there's a corpse.
You might say, as an outsider, how would you know if someone's cheating? And the answer is, well, it's in the data. I don't have to ever have seen a sumo match. I can go in the data, I can look at it, and I can tell you with almost complete certainty that there was rampant cheating going on.
In professional sumo tournaments, the wrestlers fight one bout per day for 15 days.
If you win 8 out of the 15 matches, you can move up in rank half a slot. The difference of half a rank can be maybe $5,000 in paycheck a month, the respect you get in the Sumo Association. So when you talk about stuff like that, that 8th win, it's real critical.
A Rikishi entering a tournament's final 15th match with a 7-7 record has far more to gain from a victory than an opponent with a record of, say, 8-6 has to lose. If a wrestler has 8 wins under his belt, he is guaranteed to advance, even if he loses that last match. So he can afford to take a fall. In Japan, there's a term for matchmaking, yaocho. Many suspected that sumo matches might be rigged, but it is nearly impossible to prove unless you look closely at the numbers.
2 wrestlers who I would expect to have an even match, when one of them needs the 8th win and the other doesn't, the one who needs it wins 75% of the time rather than 50% of the time. That is a huge deviation.
I, 8-6 wrestler, let you, 7-7 wrestler, win this deciding match because you, my friend, are going to fall down the pyramid if you don't. In return, the next time those 2 guys meet, lo and behold, the 8-6 wrestler almost always wins those matches.
1988年の9月から、相撲の取材を始めたんですけど、それから1月ぐらいでもそういうものがあるんだっていうのは分かりましたよね。僕らが肌で感じているその八百長の実態というか、まあ確かに証明しきれないものなんだけれども、それを数値的に裏付けてくれたなっていう印象は持ちましたね。本を一読して。原理的には簡単ですよね。別に前もって談合をして、勝つのか負けるのか勝負をあらかじめ決めておくと。でそこにお金が介在するわけですね。1番20万円だとか、あるいは30万円だとか、あるいはさっき言ったみたいに関取以下の幕下クラスだと2万円とか3万円とか、あるいはタバコ1カートンだとかね。ところが幕の内の優勝を争うような一番になると1000万円だとか2000万円だとか、あるいはもっとっていうケースもあるみたいですけど、それが基本的な八百長ですよね。やはり自分から名乗り出て証言するという方はいません。それをすると相撲という村社会から弾き出されちゃうし、で彼ら長年相撲の社会しか知らないので、外に出ていたら生活できないんですよ。
お互いに知り合い同士で仲がいい相撲取りがお互いいるわけで、付き合いですから、地位が陥落したり関取の地位から落ちたりなんかすると相手に対して同情して、手を抜くというのが基本だと思うんですけど、でそういったことをやってるってこと自体も言えなくなってしまう。僕としては相撲っていうのはそういうことありだってことをみんな見てる側も実は知ってるのに、それをだんだんと硬直化してなかったことにしていってしまったというのが、その辺の本音と建前といえば、若干そうなるかもしれません。
Hone is real truth, and tatemae would be the surface of things, the facade. They're unusually important in Japanese culture. That's why the Japanese have given them names. But being human, living in any society, I think we can all understand the concepts themselves. The tatemae is going to be a great spectacle of honest competition, but in the service of creating that pleasing facade, the actual players are engaging in a form of corruption. To have the hone exposed produces discomfort. When you think about the sorts of financial scandals that have racked America recently, a lot of people who were supposed to be not just incredibly wise, but incredibly honest have been exposed as neither.
Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief.
That produces a kind of disillusionment in any society that had formerly looked to those people or those institutions as somehow representative of what's best in that society. Sumo would be an example of that in Japan.
While I would not put the Bernie Madoff pre-arrest reputation, I wouldn't necessarily call that one of purity, the way we would talk about sumo wrestling or the way we might talk about the Catholic clergy. The SEC had an image of this guy that was almost sacrosanct in that he'd run an exchange, he'd been a market maker. His reputation was so large that it discouraged them from coming in with a bias toward corruption, and instead they brought a bias against it.
Rita, what do you have to say for yourself? What do you have to say to the public, to your investors?
The realm of high finance and the world of sumo both demonstrate that the illusion of purity can not only hide corruption, it can help to make it possible. In sumo, when whistleblowers stepped forward to expose corruption, they were not treated kindly. In 1996, two sumo veterans, including a recently retired stablemaster, collaborated on a tell-all expose that was serialized in the Shukan Post.
まあ、オーナーと親方がやった時の衝撃は結構強かったと思いますね。それなりのポジションにいた人、結構実名を挙げていてましたし、手口がかなり詳細だった。まあ、それも相撲協会としてはできたらなかったことにしようと思ったんです。
That are influencing that kid's lifetime outcomes, not just the name itself.
What kinds of issues? Well, let's look at a boy with the study.
A ver, comentarios, preguntas sobre el sumo. Vamos a parar ahí. Hay una más muy interesante sobre si podemos pagar plata para que estudien los estudiantes, ¿no? Los que están en el high school. Muy interesante. Les recomiendo, si están interesados en esos temas, a ver, voy a buscar con ustedes un documental que vi recién, lo he visto estos días. Se llama... Está en YouTube completo, no está desordenado como esto, porque es... Y esto tiene que ver con las empresas de auditoría. Los Big Four. A ver si lo ven. Les voy a copiar a Charles. Esto de Freakonomics es un libro, por si acaso, ¿no? Vamos a ver si lo encontramos. En español. Bueno, es interesante, ¿no? Más allá de... Claro que el problema de la corrupción es mirar los datos. Es posible siempre mirar los datos y mirarlos con cuidado para encontrar patrones, para encontrar secuencias, ¿no? Es muy, muy interesante. ¿Preguntas, comentarios? ¿No aparece el libro? Yo en algún lado lo tengo. Los voy a buscar. Subirá la tarea de alcances de la investigación. Mauricio, no lo he subido porque no le he podido solucionar mi archivo, el problema de mi archivo Word. Lo voy a tratar de hacer estos días, ¿de acuerdo? Mientras no suba la tarea, no hay tarea, pero le voy a dar un plazo razonable. Si alguien encuentra la película Freakonomics en algún otro lugar, avísenme, por favor. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Esta también es interesante de los 4 grandes. Preguntas, comentarios. ¿Nada? ¿No hay nada? ¿Les han gustado los videos al menos? ¿Están ahí?
Sí, licenciado, los videos estaban interesantes.
Ya. El archivo del alcance quieren que les mande. Les voy a, o sea, que no le he mandado porque como han visto está sin gráficos. Voy a tratar de corregirlo y voy a mandarles. Terminen de ver la película si pueden. Mejor si alguien la encuentra en un formato más amigable para, pues para no estar pasando de un lugar a otro. Yo, claro, yo lo paso porque conozco, como he visto la película varias veces, la conozco, pero esa no es la idea, ¿no? A ver, estoy buscando el libro para pasarles. Tengo en algún lado el libro. Libros, aquí debe estar. A ver, estoy buscando mi disco duro. Es súper divertido el libro. Yo tengo todos los libros. Porque tiene varios, tengo 4 libros. Ah, aquí está uno. Ahora les voy a pasar este. ¿Quieren que les pase al WhatsApp? ¿O quieren que les pase al... El pensar como un freak es otro. Son 3, aquí hay. El expanded, pero creo que está en inglés. Estos 2 que están en español van a pasar. Bueno. Les debo entonces el material del alcance de la investigación. Si alguien encuentra la película, me avisa. Y yo les paso ahorita los libros por si les interesa leer. Hay uno más que se llama Super Freakonomics. Pero creo que no lo tengo. ¿Qué hay uno? ¿Ver? Bueno, quedamos aquí entonces. Nos vemos el próximo miércoles. ¿El nombre de la película para poder buscarla? Sí, lo escribo ahorita. Lo mando en mensaje. Se llama Freakonomics. Ahí está. Freak, en inglés quiere decir algo extraño, raro, medio alocado. Eso es freak. Y nomics de... Freakonomics, creo que es. Freak Freakonomics. Freakonomics, perdón. Freakonomics. Freakonomics. Así. Bueno, nos vemos. Que les vaya bien, compañeros. Chao, chao.
Hasta luego, licenciado.
Hasta luego, licenciado.
Hasta luego, licenciado.
Chao, chao,
Hasta
chao.
luego.